From the beginning of the United States, moving from the Atlantic coast to the interior of the nation was problematic. There were plenty of rivers close to the coast, but getting over the Appalachian miles 400 miles inland made travel for passengers and transporting produce and freights difficult, if not impossible. It quickly became clear that if the United States was going to become a great nation, it was going to have to conquer the mountain chain. In 1807, New York Governor DeWitt Clinton developed the idea of digging a canal from the Hudson River, which eventually emptied into New York Harbor at New York City, to Lake Erie, one of the five Great Lakes. President Thomas Jefferson thought the plan was madness, but Clinton convinced the New York legislature to provide $7 million for construction of what became known as Clinton's Ditch. Construction began on the canal in 1817, and while it was not the first canal to be built in the United States, it was certainly the most ambitious project of the 1800s. It was longer than any other canal in the country, and crossed a number of rivers and valleys, and cut through rocks, marshes, and forests over the course of its 363 miles. There were 57 locks along the way to help the canal cover the 566 feet of elevation during the trip. The men who laid out the canal were completely untrained in land surveying and had no experience building canals. Those that were in charge of laying out the route were judges who had done surveying to settle boundary disputes. Some went to England, where they had been using canals for some time, just to learn how to build one. The heavy labor that went along with building the canal was done primarily by immigrants who used tools like a early bulldozer invented during the building process. By the time the initial construction of the Erie Canal was finished for the first time in 1825, it was 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep. Barges were allowed a draft of 3.5 feet. All the locks guaranteed that there was no current in the canal despite the elevation change, and the barges were tugged by mule along one side of the canal by a towpath. If barges that were traveling in opposite directions met on the canal, one barge would move to one side of the canal while the other tow operator would drop his rope, which would fall to the bottom of the canal. The mule of the initial barge would step over the tow rope and continue on their way. The other tow operator would pick up their tow rope and continue in the opposite direction. The monetary success of the canal far outpaced estimates, even though it cut those all-important shipping costs, the costs that originally had made shipping produce and freight over the Appalachian Mountains virtually impossible, by 95%. Goods and produce were shipped in both directions, either from the Midwest to New York City or vice versa. Perhaps more important, the Erie Canal led to a population explosion in western New York and made it much easier for settlers moving west to reach their destination cheaply. The population of Buffalo grew from 200 settlers in 1820 to more than 18,000 just 20 years later in 1840. The 6-day trip from Albany to Buffalo cost about 1 cent to 1.5 cents a mile, depending on whether or not a traveler ate on board the barge. By 1862, the canal was enlarged to its widest point, and some minor adjustments were made after that, but by 1918 it was replaced by the much larger New York State Barge Canal. Today, the Erie Canal is far more likely to be used for recreational use, where portions of it remain a waterway, although there is still some minor barge traffic.